To the Right Honourable Lord Herbert.
My lord, as the advantages which I enjoyed from accompanying your lordship upon your travels enabled me to collect the materials for the following work, it cannot be inscribed to any other person with so much propriety as to your lordship. You, I flatter myself, will recollect with pleasure the result of those inquiries to which you were particularly attentive, and I am happy in this public opportunity of expressing the grateful sense which I entertain of being honoured with your lordship's friendship, and of declaring the sincere regard and attachment with which I am, my lord, your lordship's most faithful and obedient servant, William Coxe. King's College, Cambridge, April 2, 1784. Preface. The following pages contain the result of that intelligence which I collected, and those observations which occurred during my travels through the northern kingdoms of Europe, and it is necessary to apprise the reader upon what foundation the principal facts are supported. In regard to Poland, I was honoured with information from persons of the highest rank and authority, and fortunately obtained possession of some original letters written from Warsaw before and during the partition, which have enabled me to throw a considerable light over that interesting period. I presume, therefore, that the account of Poland comprehends many particulars, which have not been hitherto presented to the public. With respect to Russia, as the Empress herself deigned to answer some queries relative to the state of the public prisons, this gracious condescension in so great a sovereign could not but facilitate my further inquiries. To this I must add that the late celebrated historian plus Mr. Müller favoured me with various communications on some of the most important and intricate parts of the Russian annals, and pointed out to me the most approved writers on this empire. The nature of the Swedish government rendered the sources of information easy of access, and since my return to England, several Swedish gentlemen, well versed in the constitution of their country, have supplied much additional intelligence. As the materials which I acquired in Denmark were less extensive than those collected in the other parts, the account of that kingdom is confined to those circumstances which I was able to ascertain, it having been my invariable resolution never to adopt uncertain accounts, but to adhere solely to those facts which appeared to me to be derived from the most unquestionable authorities. In the historical relations, I have had recourse to many English and foreign authors, and particularly to several German writers of unimpeached veracity, who were resident for a considerable time in some of the northern kingdoms, and from whom I have drawn many anecdotes not known to the English reader. Throughout this work, I have scrupulously cited the authors whom I have consulted, and have subjoined in the appendix to the second volume a list of the principal books employed on this occasion, with an explanation of the references by which they are distinguished. I cannot close this preface without expressing my obligations to Mr. Wraxall, Mr. Pennant, and Dr. Pulteney, for their respective assistance, acknowledged in the course of the work. Colonel Floyd also claims my sincerest thanks for communicating his accurate journal of our tour, to whose observations and descriptions, beside the extracts in the following pages, I gratefully confess myself indebted for many interesting particulars. Travels into Poland, History and Government of Poland. Book 1. Chapter 1. Researches into the origin and progress of the Polish government. An inquiry into the causes of the gradual diminution of royal prerogative and establishment of a monarchy wholly elective. Licentious power and conduct of the nobles. Bad effects of aristocratical authority. It is a matter of extreme difficulty to investigate in any country the origin and progress of its constitution, as well because the beginning of all histories is involved in obscurity and fable, as because that body of laws and usages which forms the essence of every government is not created at once in any particular period or by a single event, but generally results from a series of circumstances, many of them scarce separately discernible. In Poland, however, the political observer has this singular advantage, that a succession of accurate historians, some of whom flourished soon after the era when the most important branches of the Polish constitution were ascertained, have developed with uncommon precision and care the various occurrences and institutions from which the extraordinary form of government, at present subsisting in that kingdom, was gradually derived. By means of their authentic narratives, we are enabled to trace in what manner and from what concurrence of circumstances a monarchy nearly absolute, sunk in the course of a few centuries, without any deposition of the prince or violent convulsion, into a state of almost total aristocracy. A brief inquiry into the principal incidents which produced this remarkable constitution, accompanied by such political reflections as the progress of the detail suggests, will not, I flatter myself, prove uninteresting, and will properly introduce a view of Poland in its present state. The sovereigns of Poland are usually ranged into 4 classes: 1 of the House of Lesko, 2 of Piast, 3 of Jagellon, 4 of different families. These classes divide the history of Poland into 4 corresponding periods. 1. As the first period is generally allowed to be entirely fabulous, the best Polish historians usually commence their narratives at the second era. The earliest part even of this second epoch has an air of romance, and the account of Piast, who gave his name to a line of kings, and from whom all the natives of Poland who have ascended the throne are to this day called Piast, is little else than a series of fictions. By some he is said to have been a wheelwright, by others a common peasant, and by all to have gained the crown through the visible interposition of 2 angels. Nor indeed can we expect any faithful accounts of a people buried in barbarism, wholly without letters, and immersed in pagan superstition. We cannot therefore date the authenticity of the Polish annals earlier than the accession of Mieczysław II, the 4th sovereign of the line of Piast, A.D. 64. From his reign, Poland began to be connected with Germany, the historians of which country, as well as those of Sweden and Denmark, throw a considerable light upon Polish affairs prior to the existence of native historians. Some writers have observed that during the whole of the second period the monarchy was always elective, and the sovereign limited in his power. Others, on the contrary, have affirmed that the crown was hereditary and its authority absolute. But this controversy may be easily reconciled. The crown seemed hereditary from its continuance in the same family, and had at the same time an elective appearance, because upon the death of the king, his successor was formally nominated and recognized in an assembly of the nobility and clergy of the realm. With respect to the extent of the king's authority, his power, as in the generality of feudal governments, when exercised by an able and enterprising prince, triumphed over all control, but in the hands of an incapable sovereign was easily depressed by the privileges of a licentious and warlike nobility. Towards the close of this second period, 1347, Casimir the Great retrenched the turbulent and oppressive authority of the principal barons and granted certain immunities to the nobles and gentry. This great monarch was aware that no other expedient could introduce order into this kingdom than a limitation of the vast influence possessed by the Pluspalatines, or principal nobility. If he had been succeeded by a line of hereditary monarchs, it is probable that the barons would never have recovered their former ascendancy, and that the feudal system would have been gradually annihilated in Poland as in other parts of Europe. But his nephew Louis, King of Hungary, who succeeded him being a foreigner, was obliged, in order to ensure the possession of the throne, to subscribe certain conditions which infringed the power of the sovereign and gave fresh vigor to that of the barons and inferior nobles. The principal concessions made by Louis were not to impose any additional taxes by his mere regal authority without the consent of the nation, and that in case of his demise without male heirs, the privilege of appointing a sovereign should revert to the nobles at large. In consequence of this agreement, Louis was allowed to ascend the throne without opposition, and having no sons, he, with a view of ensuring the succession to his son-in-law, the Emperor Sigismund, married to his eldest daughter Maria, promised, in addition to all the former grants, to diminish the taxes, to repair the fortresses at his own expense, and to confer no dignities or offices upon foreigners. 3. The third period begins upon the death of Louis, 1382, when the Poles very politically set aside Sigismund, who would have been formidable to their newly acquired immunities, and elected for their king Ladislaus Jagellon, Duke of Lithuania, in consequence of his fully confirming all the stipulations of Louis, and espousing Hedwig, youngest daughter of the deceased monarch, as, by the renunciation of Louis, the kings of Poland were divested of the right to impose taxes without consent of the nation. Ladislaus assembled the nobles plus in their respective provinces in order to obtain an additional tribute. These provincial assemblies gave birth to the diets, which, however, no longer retain the power of raising money in their several districts, but only elect the nuncios or representatives for the general diet. Ladislaus III, son of Ladislaus Jagellon, purchased his nomination to the succession during the life of his father by a confirmation of all the privileges above enumerated, which he solemnly ratified at his accession. Under Casimir III, brother and successor to Ladislaus III, several further innovations were introduced into the original constitution, all unfavorable to regal prerogative. One of the principal changes which took place in this reign, and which laid the foundation of still more important revolutions in the Polish government, was the convention of a national diet invested with the sole power of granting supplies. Each palatinate or province was permitted to send to this general diet, beside the palatines and other principal barons, a certain number of nuncios or representatives chosen by the nobles and burghers. This reign is therefore considered by the popular party as the era at which the freedom of the constitution was permanently established. Casimir was engaged in several unsuccessful wars, which exhausted the royal treasures, and as he could not impose any taxes without the consent of the nation, he was under the necessity of applying repeatedly to the Diet for subsidies. Almost every supply was accompanied with a list of grievances and produced a diminution of prerogative. In Poland, as in all feudal governments, the barons at the head of their vassals are bound to fight in defense of the kingdom. Before the reign of Casimir III, the king could require such military, or, as they were called, feudal services. But this monarch, in compensation for some pecuniary aid, gave up that privilege, and renounced the power of summoning the nobles to his standard. He likewise agreed not to enact any laws without the concurrence of the national diet. John Albert, second son of Casimir, being elected in preference to his elder brother Ladislaus, King of Hungary and Bohemia, assented without hesitation, as the price of this partiality, to all the immunities extorted from his predecessors, and swore to their observance in a general plus diet held at Petrikau 1469. Alexander, brother and successor of John Albert, declared in 1505 the following limitations of sovereign authority to be fundamental laws of the kingdom. 1. The king cannot impose taxes. 2. He cannot require the feudal services. 3. Nor alienate the royal domains. 4. Nor enact laws. 5. Nor coin money. 6. Nor alter the process in the courts of justice. Sigismund I succeeded Alexander. 1. Of the Polish historian, speaking of his reign, exclaims with much indignation, "The king is almost wholly destitute of power. He cannot procure any subsidy on the most pressing emergency, for carrying on war, or for the portion of his daughters, without increasing the privileges of the nobility." Notwithstanding, however, this exclamation, we cannot forbear to remark that the power of levying taxes at discretion is the most dangerous prerogative that can be lodged in the hands of a sovereign and the most formidable engine of despotic authority. The acquisition of it by the monarchs of France finally subverted the liberties of that kingdom, and it was made the first object of resistance by the assertors of freedom in our own country. If indeed we were inclined to point out any particular period at which the Polish constitution attained its most perfect state, we should perhaps fix on the reign of Sigismund I, when the person and property of the subject were secured by ample provisions, and the crown still retained considerable influence. But the time was arrived when an inordinate passion for liberty led the nobles to render the throne wholly elective, and at each election to continue their encroachments upon the regal authority until the king was reduced to a mere pageant. The first public attempt towards establishing this favorite object of the Poles, a free election of the king, was brought forward in the reign of Sigismund Augustus, son and successor of Sigismund I, who was constrained in 1550 to agree that no future monarch should succeed to the throne, unless he was freely elected by the nation. The death of Sigismund Augustus without issue gave efficacy to this concession, which might otherwise have been counteracted by the popularity and influence attendant on a claimant by hereditary succession. For it may not be improper to remark that during the Jagellon line, the sovereigns upon their accession or election, although formally ratified to the throne by the consent of the nation, still rested their pretensions upon hereditary right as well as upon this consent, always styling themselves heirs of the Kingdom of Poland. Sigismund Augustus, in whom the male line of the Jagellon family became extinct, was the last who bore that title. 4. The fourth period commences from the demise of Sigismund Augustus in 1572, when all title to the crown from hereditary right was formally abrogated, and the most absolute freedom of election established upon the most permanent basis. At this era, a charter of immunities was drawn up at a general diet, a ratification of which it was determined to exact from the new sovereign prior to his election. The groundwork of this charter, termed in the Polish law Pacta Conventa, was the whole body of privileges obtained from Louis and his successors, with the following additions. 1. That the king should be elective, and that his successor should never be appointed during his life. 2. That the diets, the holding of which depended solely upon the will of the kings, should be assembled every 2 years. 3. That every noble or gentleman in the whole realm should have a vote in the diet of election. 4. That, in case the king should infringe the laws and privileges of the nation, his subjects should be absolved from their oaths of allegiance. From this period, the Pacta Conventa, occasionally enlarged, have been confirmed by every sovereign at his coronation. Henry of Valois, Duke of Anjou and brother of Charles IX, King of France, was the first sovereign who ascended the throne after the constitution had been thus new-modelled. He secured his election as well by private bribes to the nobles as by a stipulation to pay an annual pension to the Republic from the revenues of France. His example has been necessarily followed by each succeeding sovereign, who, beside an unconditional ratification of the Pacta Conventa, has been always constrained to purchase the crown by a public largesse and by private corruption, circumstances which endear to the Poles an elective monarchy. Under Stephen Bathory, the regal power was still further abridged by the appointment of 15 resident senators, chosen at each diet, to attend the king and to give their opinion in all matters of importance, so that he could not issue any decree without their consent. Another fatal blow was also given to his prerogative in 1578, by taking from him the supreme jurisdiction, or the power of judging in the last resort the causes of the nobles, excepting such as arise within a small distance of the sovereign's place of residence. It was enacted that without the concurrence of the king, each palatinate or province should elect in their diets their own judges, who should form supreme courts of justice called tribunalia regni plus, and that in these courts the causes of the nobles should be decided finally and without appeal, a mode of judicature which prevails to this day. The turbulent reign of John Casimir was marked by the introduction of the liberum veto plus, or the power which each nuncio claims and exercises of interposing a negative, and in consequence of that interposition of breaking up the diet, a privilege which the sovereign himself does not possess and which has contributed more than any other innovation to destroy the true balance of the Polish constitution. But the king was still the fountain of honor. He conferred the principal dignities and great offices of the Republic, and bestowed the starosties, or royal fiefs, which are held during the lifetime of the possessor. Hence he still maintained great influence in the councils of the nation, but this last solitary branch of royal prerogative was wrested from his present majesty at the establishment of the Permanent Council. Thus it appears that from the time of Louis to the present period, the nobles have continued without interruption to diminish the regal authority and to augment their own privileges. Many of the concessions which they obtained from the sovereigns of the Jagellon line were just and reasonable, and aimed only at an equitable degree of freedom. When, however, an absolute right to dispose of so tempting an object as the crown gave them repeated opportunities of prescribing unconditional terms to every candidate for the throne, they were no longer content with that equal distribution of power, which is the excellence of a limited monarchy, but aspired to and nearly attained a direct aristocracy under a regal title and form. From this general review of the revolutions in the Constitution of Poland, we may easily infer that, notwithstanding their so much boasted liberty, the Poles are by no means equally free. Indeed, their historians, however they may differ in other points, unanimously agree in reprobating their affectation of liberty, the shadow rather than the reality of freedom, which is in fact merely a turbulent system of aristocratic licentiousness, where a few members of the community are above the control of law, while the majority are excluded from its protection. We should suppose that, if in any instance they were free, it would be in the election of a king, one of their most vaunted privileges, and yet Staniski addresses the Poles with great truth in the following words: "Turn over your annals, and you will scarcely find a single example of a free election." Another Polish historian of great note, the celebrated Stanislaus Lubienki, Bishop of Płocko, justly contends that the Poles, free as they pretend to be, are absolutely in a state of slavery, to which they have been reduced by an inconsiderate passion for liberty. In a word, it is evident beyond the possibility of doubt from the history of this country that the Poles were more free at home and more independent and flourishing abroad, when the sovereign had more authority, when the nobles assisted at the diets without the privilege of dissolving them, and when they submitted themselves and their peasants to the jurisdiction of the king. The proof of this assertion is founded on the following facts. 1. The present wretched state of the towns compared with their former flourishing condition during the reigns of the Jagellon family, when the burghers even possessed a right of sending nuncios to the diets plus, attests the melancholy effects of aristocratical despotism. 2. The miserable condition and poverty of the peasants, the increase of whose oppression has kept equal pace with the increase of the power of the nobles. For when the king lost his weight in the constitution, this most numerous and useful order of society lost a patron and protector. 3. A total confusion introduced into the administration of public affairs, and a state of anarchy which prevents deliberation and delays the adoption of necessary measures even in times of the most pressing emergency. 4. The declension of the importance and contraction of the territories of the Republic. During the reigns of the kings of the Jagellon family, before the nobles had acquired a decided preponderancy in the state, the Kingdom of Poland was far more powerful and extensive than it is at present. Since the changes in the constitution and the introduction of anarchy, falsely called liberty, the Poles have not only made no conquest, which they have not been forced to relinquish, but have seen even their original territories gradually mouldering away, and at last considerably reduced by the late partition. A kingdom with more than 12 millions of inhabitants, if well regulated, would never have fallen so easy a prey to the ambition of its neighbours. Its internal strength, assisted by its natural alliances, would have been sufficient to have protracted, if not prevented, its dismemberment. Nor are the fatal effects of the evils inherent in the constitution yet fully exhausted. The same incapacity of resisting the encroachments of neighbouring powers, which made the Poles so tamely accede to the late division, will render them equally submissive whenever any future claims shall be urged by a combination of the neighbouring states, and compel them to acquiesce under any pretensions, however chimerical or however unjust. Anarchy, in short, and confusion are not only tolerated, but are even supported by the nobles who reap the benefit of those evils to be absolutely necessary for the support of the constitution, so that there is a proverb which implies that Poland subsists by anarchy. In opposition to this absurd idea, an historian whom I have before cited advises his countrymen no longer to suffer the Republic to be governed by chance, or to submit to the cast of the die the administration of affairs on which their very existence as a nation depends. King Stanislaus Leczinski and the Abbé Konarski are the most celebrated of the modern Polish authors who have exposed in the strongest colours the disorders of the government and the exorbitancy of the privileges possessed by the nobles. But what avail the representations of historians against factions, against a tumultuous nobility, or against the cabals of neighbouring powers? It is hardly possible to suppose that Poland, without an army, without money, without fortresses, without resources, and without good government, the source of all the other calamities, will ever emerge from her present situation. Her misfortunes will not only continue, but will gradually increase, notwithstanding the remonstrances of a few real patriots, until by slow progress, or some violent revolution, Poland either subsides into an hereditary monarchy or a well-ordered republic, or, which is more probable, is totally swallowed up by the neighbouring powers.